All right. Hi, everybody. This is Isaac, and I'm here for another conversation, this time with theologian Kevin Hargaden. Kevin, thank you so much for joining me. Why don't you tell us more about yourself, introduce yourself to everybody?
Thanks, Isaac. It's a real delight to be able to have this chat with you. I am a theologian who lives and works in Dublin, where I'm from, in Ireland. I'm a Presbyterian myself, but in a bizarre and convoluted chain of events, I've ended up serving as a theologian for the Jesuits in Dublin, where I lead a kind of theological social centre called the Jesuit Centre for Faith and Justice. So I work with social scientists and environmental scientists to try to help the Irish government to think through their policies more ethically, and we do that particularly from a Catholic social teaching perspective.
Amazing. Yeah, I'm sure that's actually a pretty friendly theological environment to be in. I don't know, is that the case?
Yeah. I can't quite account for why they gave me the job, but they've been amazing to work with, and I've enjoyed it a great deal. And I think it's a place where I'm very happy, and the small team we work incredibly well together. And even though we're remote at the moment, we're spread across the country and relating to each other on Zoom and email. We're still managing to get some work done and enjoying the work. And yeah, it's a good setup we have.
Great. So I asked you to join us today because you specifically focus on wealth and the parables of Jesus, Christian ethics when it comes to wealth, and sort of the unique economic times we live in. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, my theological research began in the pastorate. I was working in a small Presbyterian church on the outskirts of Dublin, where people were working during what we call the Celtic Tiger, which was this period of amazing economic growth that transformed Ireland from being a second world country to being one of the wealthiest nations on the planet. And so my congregation, which was quite largely composed of new Christians, they would come to me and they'd say, look, we're reading the Gospels and Jesus seems to have a real problem with wealth. But every year, Google or Intel or whoever it was they were working for, they give us more and more money, and we have more money than we can cope with. So how do we square these two things? And when I went away to try to find some kind of Christian framework to help them navigate the problem that they were discovering with wealth, I found that the last really great thinking about this was John Wesley. And his advice was to earn as much as you can, to save as much as you can, and to give as much as you can. And that was great advice for an agrarian English working class that was moving into cities and getting jobs in factories. And this gave, it transformed society. There's no point in me telling this story to the Methodists. but it's actually right now advice that intensifies the problem. Because if I was to say that to a middle manager in Intel or to a computer software engineer in Google, then that advice just makes them wealthier and wealthier. So I wanted to
just to pause
look into that. Yeah.
I mean, I think Wesley was pretty explicit about his intention that that's exactly what he thought it was meant to do, to create a middle class in a lot of ways. And then certainly the Methodist Church in America, kind of glommed onto that idea, and a lot of the restrictions that we were known for in the early 20th century about, like, especially temperance and no gambling, were based on this idea that Christianity should help mold you and from a working class to like a middle class citizen, at least here anyway. Sorry, keep going.
Yeah, no, and I think I don't think that we should jump immediately away from the intrinsic good sense there is in that. I think that there's a tendency maybe amongst theologians to kind of dismiss the attractions of the bourgeoisie. But if you are moving from a position of subsistence into a position of stability, then let's not diss that. But the context that I was in was a different one entirely. Mm-hmm. And so I went Aberdeen to study with this great theologian there, Brian Brock, to try to think about the particular problem that we had encountered, which was why the parables of Jesus are so baffling to us on the question of wealth. And how do we account for the gap between the skepticism that Jesus seems to have for wealth and the instinctive positive attitude that we have towards its accumulation. So that's kind of my my intellectual background in sketch form.
Great. So I think that one of the things I like about your work is that you are grounding your theological reflection in that very specific context of the 2008 financial crisis in Ireland and sort of the lives of actual people. But you talk a lot about this idea called neoliberalism, and some people say it has no definition. Other people may have never even heard the word. So how can we understand that huge question, what is neoliberalism? And does our current, like, what are the key concepts behind getting a handle on it?
I think it's easy to understand why there's skepticism towards this concept, because too often we find that people use it as a catch-all term for anything they don't like. But there's a fairly vast literature on the topic, and there is a body of people who self-declared themselves neoliberals. So that's where I root my research. That's an organization, a society that was founded in the 1930s called the Mont Pelerin Society, and it's still active today. I know some of its members. They're a bunch of economists and social scientists who have a particular vision for how society ought to be structured. And they have been very canny and very strategic and hugely effective in seeing that implemented across the world. Very patient in terms of how they've managed to achieve success in terms of their policy vision. You can look at it historically. So neoliberalism, or those ideas associated with neoliberalism, took root first in Chile after the CIA backed a coup that installed a dictator called Pinochet. But for me, I think in the Western world, it's most appropriate for us to think about it in terms of Reagan and Thatcher, who, conservatives in America, as best as I understand it as an outsider, recognized that Reagan represented a break from the conservatism that came before it, that he was this bold and visionary leader with a particular vision. And that vision maps pretty closely onto the neoliberal ideas. So what are they? Primarily, it involves deregulating the marketplace so that the genius of the entrepreneur is allowed to run free. It means liberalizing the marketplace so that constraints on competition are restricted. And it means privatizing state services. So what once was a semi-state body ought to be floated on the stock market and allowed to compete like other actors in the marketplace. I think at the moment there might be a proposal for the postal service in America to go that way. Mm-hmm. So across the Western world, we've seen that process replicated over the last 40 years in varying ways and at different speeds. But what that means is that the metaphor of market competition becomes the dominant metaphor for how we structure our society. And if you wanted me to summarize then what neoliberalism is in a tweet length kind of quotation, it would be the disenchantment of politics so that it serves only the idea of competition. What does that mean? Well, it means that universities have to compete against each other. It means that secondary schools have to compete against each other. It means that pastors have to compete against each other. And this idea that somehow market efficiency will bring about the collective good is applied in every sector of our lives. So that's the neoliberal age in which we live. That doesn't mean that everybody is constantly calculating their self-interest. We're all free still to engage in actions and in practices that aren't in any way competitive. You know, my decision to go and research this stuff was not an economically rational decision. I was in a good job, and I took a tiny little bursary and moved from beautiful Dublin to a really awful city in Scotland to do this research. So we're still allowed and we're still free to engage in our own romantic, irrational interests. But even that needs to be justified. So that's neoliberalism, and it plays out today in terms of the anxiety-inducing demand that you generate yourself to always be productive.
Okay, that's a great segue, because one of the things that you claim in your book is, and you hit on it already a little bit with this notion of pastors competing with each other. If you've ever, I don't know if y'all have the term church shopping in Ireland, but
of course, I'm very skilled at church shopping. Yeah.
I mean, that is, if you're listening to this and have never heard the term before, but have said, I'm going church shopping, then you are living in an age of neoliberalism. But one of the things that you talk about is in your research is that it's not just an economic policy, it also ends up shaping, our sort of cultural reality. And specifically, you talk a lot about the way neoliberalism shapes time. And I think that's a really interesting thing to discuss right now, because I think one of the main things that I see people struggling with under pandemic and working at home and not being able to go into their workplace or, interact with people in public spaces is this, concern about productivity and are we using our time well while we're at home. There are people who are having to homeschool their children right now, and there are lots of debates about how intense that should be, and some people making curriculums that would, get their kids an entire grade level ahead if they really applied them or something like that, versus, this notion that actually instead of this productive time, it's a time of crisis. And how do we, not mask that and sort of wrestle with the reality of it? So tell me a little bit about the way that neoliberalism kind of shapes the way that we think about time, and in order to help kind of ground this in a practical reality for people.
It's a great question, but it at least as I explain it, runs the risk of spiraling far away from practicalities. In Augustine's famous Confessions, he addresses the topic of time, but it's in the section of the Confessions that most people don't ever properly read because it's so far removed from the immediate biography. So, the first 10 or 12 chapters of Confessions it's eminently readable, it's wonderful. And then at the end, he goes philosophical and dwells on time. And I fear that without any of his genius or insight, I will be the same way. The long and the short of it is that neoliberalism commodifies things because the way that you achieve efficiency and productivity is through measurement, and that whole rationale of market competition requires that you're able to measure like for like. So your Methodist church has to be able to be compared against the local Presbyterian church for me to make an informed decision as a church shopper. And time is the critical place where it's the baseline metric by which we make measurements about efficiency. In fact, what is efficiency except a particular way, an applied way of thinking about time? Mm-hmm. I'm a more efficient worker than you simply means that I'm able to get more things done in the same amount of time. So there's various ways to think about this. I like the formulation from the practical theologian John Swinton, who talks about clock time and how capitalism imposes on us this understanding of time as a thing that's broken down into hours and minutes and seconds, sitting inside years and months and weeks, days. And what that means is that we're not paying attention to the actual moment in which we're living. We're always paying attention to the moments a couple of seconds ahead of us. So we're in quarantine now, we're in lockdown, and we're suffering this anxiety because as we joke with one another, we don't know what day of the week it is. We're losing sense of where we are in relation to clock time. I think that's a real problem for Mammon. The lockdown itself is its own form of crisis for the economy, but it's not a problem for Christ. I think that the theological conception of time is that we're always short of it, but that's not a problem because God has all the time in the world. And as Karl Marx says, we have an allotment of time on this planet, and there's no point in worrying about how much longer there is to come. You ought to be concerned only with the moment that you're in right now. So I think that there's a possibility for us to reimagine our relationship with time through this quarantine. And one of the ways I can testify to this working out personally is the realization that I don't know if it's the same in Ireland, but the hand washing recommendation in Ireland is you can sing happy birthday twice. And it takes 20 seconds. So, you know, you have a whole nation of Irish people singing the melody and then repeating it, and they know that they've soaked their hands enough. For me, it's the Our Father, which takes the same amount of time. But of course, something is going on there that's a lot more than 20 seconds. When I take that opportunity to wash my hands, I'm doing that as an act of solidarity for those who are vulnerable in my community to try to slow the process of spread of this virus. And I'm also then bringing my concerns for those who are suffering to the Lord. And that is a timeless and eternal activity. And the Lord hears each and every one of those prayers in the present moment. And the kairos breaks in on the chronos, to use very fancy Greek terms, in that moment. So I think that there are lots of ways that we can engage creatively with this strange, empty time and fill it up with an understanding of time that subverts this tyranny of the clock under which we live, before the crisis, and almost certainly will live again after the crisis. Does that make sense? Is that in any way helpful?
Yeah, I think that's very helpful. And you know, I think that in a lot of ways what it comes down to is that time becomes a unit of exchange, just like anything else in the marketplace. You know, it becomes a source of wealth. We have that phrase, time is money.
Yeah.
And it becomes something that I think people find themselves in competition with in their own lives. You know, how much time do I have for my work? How much time do I have for my children? How much for my spouse, for my, you know, own self-care? Like, you know, I think that the demands of the workplace, when it comes down to it, get really can clash with what God would see as time, that or as what God would call it, how God would call us to view time in a way that was holy. And I think, you know, we see this on Sunday morning, that Christians spending an hour a week, and that's the time that God gets, and then everything else is given over to their work, a vast majority of it. And yeah, so I think that, you know, one of the things that you say is problematic about wealth, just to get into it, is that this neoliberalism that we're living under, it demands our allegiance. It courts us. It actively tries to sort of bring us into its story so that we're constantly serving it rather than serving God. And this is you know, obviously the neoliberalism bit is different, but this idea that money and your faith are diametrically opposed isn't something you came up with. It comes from Jesus. So how do those things end up competing with each other, and how are we, you know, being chased by the market?
I think that chased is the correct term. I think we're being seduced at all times by the promises of neoliberal capitalism. I have a colleague from Aberdeen, Emily Hill, who's based in Ohio now, works with InterVarsity, and she was a marketing executive for a very, very large global concern before she abandoned ship and went to study theology. And she has the statistics to hand about how many advertisements we engage with in a day. But since the onset of the internet, we're talking in terms of 4 or 5, and in some cases maybe 10,000 advertising signals every day. And we would be incredibly naive if we thought that this vast expense was being invested by the corporations of the world and it wasn't impacting us. You know, we've all met the guy who says that he's not influenced by advertising, but presumably the bosses in the corporations who are spending all this money on advertising have decided that that is worthwhile.
Yeah.
So our hearts are being shaped by this is classic Augustinian theology here, that which we dedicate our time towards is going to form us. And whether we've consciously decided that we're going to be formed by capitalism is imposing itself on us. So what are the good things it promises? It promises security, and it promises us the good life. And if you succeed, I think the COVID pandemic has demonstrated that it does offer security. If you are a millionaire, then you are absolutely, in numerical terms, safer than somebody who is on the minimum wage. So it promises us that if we accumulate enough money, then we will be safe and we will have the affluence required to have a good life. And I think that one of the things that marks neoliberalism as different from generic or older forms of capitalism is that it's not just the idea that affluence is a good, but it's the idea that your success is about winning. So the market competition takes place within you so that you think about yourself as a winner, meaning that there are those who are losers. And that is a vicious cycle, whether you succeed or whether you fail. Obviously, if you are not a winner in Western societies, there are all kinds of subtle cues to communicate that to you constantly, that you are not pulling your weight, that you're a parasite, that you're a waste of space. And that is corrosive of your self-esteem on a very fundamental level. But we as Christians also believe that it's incredibly dangerous to be a success in that context, especially those of us who are very committed to Protestant ideas about grace, to live in a society where you are quietly told at all times that your effort and your toil have been acknowledged and rewarded. It's the exact opposite of the promise that Jesus makes us at Easter. So it's a dangerous proposition for us, but it seduces our hearts because it tells us that enough money will make you secure, and if you put in the work, then you will be proven to be of merit because you will have done better than your neighbor.
Yeah, I mean, so there, this is maybe a good time to turn to the parables, because Jesus has some pretty challenging ones for that notion of security. And I think that that idea that if you play the game long enough, you can win. It also comes with this logic of intense sacrifice, right? Like it's
Yeah.
If you give yourself over completely to this at the exclusion of all else, then you'll be okay. I constantly see this in the lives of people my age who are like, well, I want to dedicate time to justice issues, or they go into a line of work initially with good intentions to do things like in the law or in medicine or in other fields where they're like, I'm here because I want to make the world a better place, and then they find out that the cost of their education is so high that they have to make compromises morally on the kind of work they want to do until some future day when they've kind of won the game, and then they'll be able to get back to doing the moral stuff. But until then, they kind of just they find themselves in a place where they're the philosophical program or the religious one that took them into a certain line of work that is about neighbor care can't they have to compromise on that until they're financially secure enough in order to really do that work that they were set out for, because the market demands such an incredible amount of education and expertise and indebtedness that comes from getting those things that it kind of creates a class of indentured servitude, especially in a university town like Charlottesville with UVA. And I think that's a discussion that a story that goes for a lot of people that are probably listening to this or working there. So let's talk about the parables, because I think this is you talk a lot about the skepticism that some people might have about parables, but what we've set up here is that this is a storytelling competition between these two worldviews. So what role do they play?
If it's a competition, then they're almost playing different sports, because the story that neoliberalism tells is always neat and tidy. It's clearly demarcating those who've won from those who've lost. That's not some kind of eternal mystery stored in the mind of God. That's visible in the fact that I drive a 2006 Toyota Yaris, and the next guy down the road has a fancy Porsche. Well, we know who's the winner, who's the loser. When we turn to the parables, what we find is a set of stories that absolutely refuse to be tidied up. They stink in terms of pedagogy. You know, they're Jesus's moral instruction, but the Gospels themselves testify to how the disciples couldn't understand them. They're the guys who spend their life with Jesus. They walk and eat and sleep with him, and he tells these stories, and they're baffling. So here we are, 2,000 years later. What hope do we have of making sense of them? So you have neoliberalism promising this totalized and fairly straightforward, almost soteriology. As you've put it, sacrifice, give it 110%, put the hours in, and the market in its beneficence will recognize you. And then you turn to Jesus, and he's asked what the kingdom of God is like, and he says, it's like a farmer who goes out into the field, and he throws some seed on the ground, and then he goes to sleep, and he doesn't know what happened. But in the morning, there's a plant there. This is not a... he would fail if he was being trained as a teacher, and this was his kind of course material. So the parables are obviously functioning on a different level from the stories that we're used to in our society, and I'm struck by how psychologically accurate they are. I feel like even though they're tiny little sketches, I can empathize with the characters. I'm struck by how subtle they are. How the details can very quickly do a 180-degree turn for me in what the story means or how the story functions. And I'm struck by how, in practically every single case, they're surds, they're irrational remainders that I can't possibly resolve. And that's what I love about the parables, that they're stories that I cannot neatly put away on a shelf and say, oh, well, that's what that means. This is the moral that I take from it, because I settle on that, and then I go back to the story again another week, and I realize, actually, in a different light, this story has a different perspective. So that's why we're still preaching them 2,000 years later. That's why they never go past their sell-by date. They're always fresh and they're never stale. But they're in competition against neoliberalism because they refuse to be instrumentalized. These are the least efficient stories you can imagine in terms of imparting a vision for a kingdom. So as a manifesto, they tease instead of seduce. And I'm struck by that.
Yeah, I think that, when I went to Duke Divinity School, a professor, Amy Laura Hall, who I think you know.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, she really, I think in a lot of ways, kind of burst my bubble when I first got there about Methodism and progress, and and tangentially about, neoliberalism as well. But I think that one of the things she always tries to drill into our heads is that, Jesus isn't going to make himself useful to us.
Yes, yeah.
And I think that it's telling that in churches where people do want to make Jesus useful, or in the academy, I think that there are a number of people who want to make Christians useful for projects of power. Typically, they don't really engage on a scriptural basis with these things. I think about Joel Osteen, and when I tune in to whatever he's saying, I'm not really hearing him digging into the scriptural complexities of, the parable of the unjust steward. I'm hearing him tell you that Jesus wants you to be a winner in this society. And so I think that we even see that in Jesus's life, especially around Holy Week. There are a number of people, there are so many different complexities of the social moment that he lives in that are pulling at him, and how can, this constant question about kingship and what that means. And it means one thing to Pilate and religious authorities, and to Jesus and the gospel writers, it means, him being crowned and his crucifixion. And so I think that that notion that Jesus isn't going to allow himself to be put to work as a tool for various sort of social programs, I think is really important when you're talking about why we are still reading the parables, because we're getting back to that question of time. They are timeless in a way that means that their meaning can strike us in a completely new way every time, because when we read them, we're entering an encounter with God. It's no longer that particular Chronos time, like you said. We're now being met and challenged in that hearing and proclamation, and we enter into sort of an alternative place. And that's why I think we can still read them 2,000 years later, because they just don't play by the same rules.
Yeah, I think that's all entirely right. And I'm struck in listening to you talk about this in gospel terms. All the stories we tell are in our society are intended to help people to understand, to build up knowledge. And I think one way to think about the parables is that they do the opposite. They shatter what we thought was knowledge. So the story of the two prodigal sons is very striking to small children because of the extraordinary compassion of the father and the idea that you are always welcome back home. It's very striking to hardworking adults when they realize that the son who is the actual focus of the story is the dutiful, religiously observant, upstanding member of society that is the older son. The stories shift. And when we say shift, it means they unsettle our foundations of knowledge. And I think that that's why they serve the gospel so well, because what is the gospel except a profound revealing of the fact that we're not God, and that if we were to create a invasion program to try to reclaim planet Earth for the kingdom, we definitely wouldn't have set something up whereby God incarnate gets crucified by a regional Roman administrator. So the whole idea of the gospel is one that is foolishness and a stumbling block, and the parables bring us back to that ground clearing place where we can hear the Holy Spirit say, "Grace might not make sense, but it is the truth." And I can't get away from them. I love them. They are the best things that I've ever read.
Well, why don't we talk about one specifically? Because I think that it's probably best to just take people right into that encounter. So you want to talk about the parable of the unjust steward, which are we looking at Luke 16 here?
Yeah, I was looking at Luke 16 over lunch, and I think I need to be clear, Isaac. I want to talk about this because I don't understand it. It's not like I've come here with a kind of bag full of insights and illuminations. This is a story that I can't get my head around. I don't know why Luke included it. This should have been cut out. And yet here it is, right after the parables that we all know and love about the widow who's lost a coin, and about the sheep, and about the prodigal sons. So it's baffling to me in a way that I just can't shake.
So to summarize it for folks, this is Luke 16, 1 through 13. And you probably heard this last year when we were in the Luke lectionary year, but it's about a rich man who finds out that his manager is squandering his property, and he calls the manager into account, and the guy knows he's going to lose his job. So he goes to people who owe the rich man debt, and tells them, forgive some of their debt in order to try to curry favor with them once he's been expelled from the house. And he's got that incredibly honest line for pastors, which is, I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm too ashamed to beg, which is the truth for every pastor. We can't do anything else because we're literally not good for anything else. But he reduces these other men's debts, and when the master finds out about it, he's commended for it. And Jesus ends it by saying this very, vexing thing: for the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. So, do you see this parable as offering a interpretation of wealth that is sort of in conflict with Jesus's other parables? Do you see it as unique in some way? What is so, why in the world does Jesus, who has told us not to store up treasure in heaven, not to store up treasure in this life, literally doesn't want to accumulate wealth, is an itinerant homeless preacher himself who relies on the goods of others? Maybe that's a form of dishonest wealth. Like, why is he, he also tells the parable about security, about the rich man who decides to keep building barns and then dies that night. He's very skeptical about using wealth for anything. So what is it about this parable that, does it change any of that for Jesus? Why is he telling us this?
I think that the temptation is to try to, there's about 40 parables depending on how you count them, and the temptation is to try to get them to line up in such a way as to allow us to kind of rebuild a systematic theology of Jesus of Nazareth. We have this one here from Matthew 4 and this one here from Luke 16, and we might be able to create some kind of overlap that allows us to develop some principles, and then we can apply those principles for discipleship and for church growth, and for all the other nuts and bolts businesses of church. And that's a mistaken impulse. I think each story has to be taken on its own and not necessarily seen as casting light on another parable. Maybe in the ministry of Jesus, there was some cohesive syllabus tying them all together, but the gospel writers haven't left that for us, or at least no one has yet discovered how those pieces fit together. So I whether it's right or wrong, I've always taken it as an interpretive principle that we should just look at the story itself. And this story doesn't get easier by cutting it off from the other parables. There are various ways in which we have tried to accommodate or domesticate the apparent message, or maybe to evade the apparent message. I know I'm a Christian from an evangelical background, but that might mean something different in Ireland than it does in America, but a conservative Protestant background, and I've heard this preached so that it's a lesson about making a plan. Making a wise plan. I mean, it's a crazy interpretation, but obviously the preacher was given difficult material by Jesus. The master gave him a story he couldn't handle, and he tried his best to compress it down into something that me and the rest of the congregation could understand. Elsewhere, I've read that it's about investing in heaven as opposed to investing in earth, which is kind of fine, but it doesn't deal with the unrighteous mammon phrase that Jesus uses. And I've read all kinds of convoluted stuff in the commentaries about how the master is at fault, because it's clear that the master is trading in interest and usury, and Jews weren't allowed to do that. So this is some kind of commentary on the master. And that's one of the classic ways in which academics escape the perplexity of the recalcitrance of the parables. We say, oh, this isn't about God. This is actually about us. But I think for the large part, these parables are about God. And in this parable, he's the steward is crap at his job. He's lost all this money. He's about to be made redundant. As you say, he's not good for any manual labor. He's too proud to go out and beg. And so instead he gives massive discounts to all of his master's debtors. And instead of being brought forward on fraud charges by the Department of Public Prosecution, he's praised by his boss and he gets to keep his job. And Jesus says, use unrighteous mammon to make friends. So therefore, why are we not going out and setting up pornography websites to fund our evangelism campaigns? The straightforward and apparent meaning of this is scandalous. It absolutely doesn't make sense. This is ethical teaching. If it wasn't for the fact that Jesus gave this teaching, what would we make of it? And I think that there is something that we ought to sit with there. Verse 11 says that if you haven't been faithful with your handling of money, then why would you be given credit for handling something important? So I think that that's maybe Luke coming in and offering us some theological insight for what the story is about. But my best guess at this point is that it's not directly about how to be a good middle manager in a large multinational corporation, but it's about Israel. And this is my best effort for understanding it in terms of Jesus's own context and Jesus's own ministry, is that God the Father is the wealthy master, and that Israel is a steward. And in a time of crisis, the steward is perhaps tempted to tighten the boundary lines and to make sure that all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. But in fact, the appropriate thing to do in the economy and logic of the kingdom is to loosen those bonds and to be reckless with things that the boss has given you. So it's the job of Israel, the light of the nations, the one who's been, the people who've been entrusted with God's creation. It's their job to open up the boundaries now that Jesus has arrived. That's my best effort. But there's so much in the parable that would leave my account of it deeply unsatisfying. And so the fact that I can't have the last word is the great utility of the parable to us, that we can't neaten it down.
Sure. So I think that, so when we're thinking about this in terms of wealth, then, the action that the manager takes is that he takes these debts and forgives them, partly to curry favor. And so he's taking, under your interpretation, it would be like he's taking what God has given as, sort of sole possession to Israel, this election, and
yes,
and giving portions of it out to others outside of that framework. And, in this case, you could read that as God introducing grace to Gentiles, to those who overhear Jesus, who come close to him. And certainly it's an interesting way to think about it, because there's so many Gentile characters in the Gospels who act extravagantly or against social codes in order to get to Jesus, and he rewards them for it when they do. But I think that as far as like this notion of dishonest wealth and how we relate to this, one reading I've encountered before is that this is a sort of a call for redistribution of accumulated wealth within a neoliberal order. So we should take, people who are like, let's just say someone in a church works in the fossil fuel industry, and they work for an oil company, and they would have had money yesterday, but not necessarily today. But that, if they work in that field, that a good way to subvert kind of the harm that's being done to the environment through their work is to allow the kingdom of God to use that dishonest wealth for the purposes of grace and mercy or something else. Do you think that that's a legitimate interpretation of the parable? And in some ways, if you do you think it kind of allows us once again to kind of wash our hands of some of the complexities of what you're discussing.
It definitely tempts us to doing that, but I do think your hunch is correct, because while we don't want to create some kind of systematic theology of the parables, we do have to recognize that they are in the Gospels, and so we have stories like Zacchaeus, which isn't parabolic and therefore should be interpreted differently. But Zacchaeus is a man who has ill-gotten gain, and when confronted with the grace of Jesus, just divests himself entirely in a way that in its own terms is economically baffling. How in a first century he'd have 4 times the wealth that he'd robbed is a mystery for economic historians. So I think that it's an excellent interpretation, that if you are caught up in one of the industries of unrighteous mammon, which is pretty much all of them, including the church, and you have an abundance, then whatever you do have in your hands, treat it like it is actually the kingdom of God's. So be reckless with it. I think whatever way you cut this parable, the reason why it's problematic to us in the 21st century is it leaves us very little space for John Wesley style stewardship, for conscientious, diligent, and detail attentive management of resources. Instead, what we have is vast squandering, and the logic of the master's praise of the steward has to be that the master has an abundance far beyond what can be imagined by the debtors or by the steward. So that would incline me to think that if you have inherited a huge amount of Exxon Mobil shares, then yesterday would have been a really good day to sell them. Today, I mean, things will be better in July. Hold them till August, sell them, and then find the most interesting bunch of Christians you can and back them with the work that they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that ultimately, so when we're thinking, if you're a person that's watching this, and, I think that we've talked about this a little bit, that, well, I sent you a question about this, but there's this growing conversation around wealth in the academy and the theological world, but it's a subject that most pastors can't even really talk to their congregations about, even though it's the thing that Jesus, teaches more about than anything else. And I think it's because it's so uncomfortable for people, because they feel like, okay, I'm in this conundrum that you already described, very well off in a Western country, that wealth is kind of the spoils of a lot of death and destruction that is ongoing. So what does it look like? You make some sort of prescriptive claims at the end about what an alternative is, or what an escape is to that conundrum. And so we've kind of talked about a practical level of this like parable of dishonest wealth, and maybe it means that the church shouldn't set up a pornography website to fund its evangelism, but at least it should not turn its nose up at I don't know, but turn its nose up completely at the world, but on some level that it needs to be just as smart as others in it. But what are we to do ultimately? It goes back to that question that gets posed in Luke 18. If rich people can't be saved, then who can? Like, what is Jesus's ultimate? Like, what is his story telling us to do about all of this if we're in sort of an intractable situation?
I can promise you that anyone who has an answer to that question is wrong. It's just the one thing I know for certain is that is a challenge every Christian is going to have to face, and the answer is going to be different from Christian to Christian, and that runs the risk of people evading it. So be it. That's the way that Jesus has left it. There is no straightforward answer to that question. But the church, in fairness to her, has not been wrestling with that complexity. So I think that when it comes to talking and thinking about money, we do need to spend time on the passages that confuse us, perplex us, or make us feel uncomfortable. And if there are congregation members watching and listening, they need to give you license to stray into that boggy, treacherous territory and risk offending them. I feel like the congregation needs to be liberal in terms of allowing their pastor to ruffle feathers, and that's a very direct act of Christian discipleship that can be engaged upon to take seriously how a rich person can be saved. Is ask the pastors that the Lord has put before you to give you ideas as to how to handle your wealth. They may not be financial advisors. They may not be giving you wise stewardship advice, but we recognize that they're there for a reason. And in the logic of the kingdom, they have more competence or more capability, not by dint of clericalism, but just by position through the Holy Spirit's vocation to guide us. And I think then pastors need to be willing to experiment. I did my PhD under Stanley Hauerwas, who you might have known from Duke Divinity, and he has this idea that every church member should have to declare how much they earn every year.
Yeah, I wondered if that was going to come up. Yeah.
So that's a proposal in terms of an experiment that Stanley suggests that, because what it would do is it would level the playing field. My book assumes that everybody in the West is wealthy out of this kind of sleight of hand, because statistically someone on welfare in Ireland has more cash than somebody who's in the middle class in India. But of course it's not true that we're all equal. And if everybody in the church, if it was clearly stated that Kevin earns 47,000 euros, then we'd know what that means against somebody who's trying to get by on 22,000 euros. And we might look the same. We both have cars, we both have houses, we both have, clothes, but there's a massive difference in terms of comfort there. So those kinds of experiments in imagining that Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 4, where the community held everything in common, imagining that that's real and not a fantasy, that would be the place where I would recommend churches to go. And one of the ways that I've been thinking about this is in terms of shared investments. So I don't understand why churches don't create for themselves little small investment companies with the purpose either A, of supporting the members in the congregation who don't have as much through home loans or whatever, student debt perhaps in the American context, or in terms of the community good of the towns and cities in which they're based. So I think that pooling resources, experimenting and pooling resources will be a direct way of understanding and interpreting Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 4 as pinnacle pieces of scripture. So my advice is that congregations should demand that their pastors say something, and then give them charity if they say something that is wrong or offensive. And then pastors should take the risk of saying, here's a thing we can do. We say that the scriptures are our inspired source of wisdom. We see that this is the vision that we're called to, of sharing everything in common, of worshiping together. Let's try and do that.
So that's a really interesting idea. So about the investment company, I want to pause on that for a minute. So the idea there is that, like, you would create a stock portfolio that was invested in by church members, and then whatever yields came from that would be redistributed for particular needs. Is that the basic idea?
Yeah, I mean, it's. I know that the American Jesuits have engaged in this in a very concerted fashion. They, along with a bunch of other Catholic orders, invest strategically in heavily polluting industries, and then serve as activist shareholders. Having gained a certain proportion of shares, they're able to kind of exert their influence on the policies that those companies follow. So I'm thinking about that, but just on a much smaller scale. So when you have a wealthy and affluent congregation, they might have the wherewithal to create a little kitty, a little fund that grows, but instead of it being administered in a way that speaks of worldly stewardship, it would reflect instead the kind of stewardship that we see in the parables, in its recklessness and its generosity towards those who are in need. And that would be worked out. Again, I don't have any plans or principles for how this would apply. It would be discerned by each community as to what is the pressing need. And you could make all kinds of arguments there for trying to bless your neighbor, to bless your enemy, to bless the person furthest from you. You could make all kinds of arguments for using that yield in the least strategic way possible in worldly terms. You could do all kinds of prophetic things, but the task before us as Christians in the Western world is to start thinking about the things we could do. We have the wealth, which gives us opportunities in the neoliberal market. But we're currently just satisfying ourselves with the fact that this is an awful dilemma and no one has a simple, straightforward answer. Instead, let's try to come up with answers.
Yeah. I mean, I think that maybe to our final kind of interest or area of focus here can be about something that's been implicit in all of this, but not really brought out, which is this, notion of the. I mean, we're about to all feel its sting again, but this biting notion of austerity under neoliberalism.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll let you offer up a definition in a second. But on the other hand of that, what you're talking about is the abundance of the kingdom of God, and not just abundance, but using that abundance in a profligate way. If I can reference Amy Laura Hall again and her Twitter handle, but that there's so much that God doesn't hold anything back, and certainly doesn't ask us to live on scraps the way that we might be invited to do so under austerity. So can you talk about those two pieces of logic as another part of a competitive way that Mammon and Christ are telling stories in our world?
Yeah, I mean, the risk, Isaac, of us comparing those two things against each other is that we're going to see just how much more power Mammon appears to have. Because my tiny little church in the suburbs of Dublin might one day put these ideas into practice, and we end up with like a yield at the end of the year of €900. What are we going to do with that? Meanwhile, Bezos is making €9 million a minute.
Yeah.
There's a sense in which all of these conversations have to be thoroughly doused in a gospel sense of humor, because the best that we can hope to do is to make a prophetic gesture. We're not going to undo capitalism, and that's really important. That the gospel is not another mode of activism. The goal of Jesus is to bring about a liberation that's more profound than the revolution that I hope arrives someday to end neoliberalism. So with that very large disclaimer in place, I will say that there's a driving assumption in the modern world that we don't have enough to go around. That's why you have to take care of yourself first. Because if you engage in this altruistic, idealistic nonsense that Hargaden and his ilk proffer, then you will be left with insufficiency and with deprivation. If the scriptures are at all true, there is more than enough for us to share liberally. I mean, it's hard for me to even begin to make that argument because it's so overwhelming throughout the scriptures, but it's sufficient for us to ask people to consider how often Jesus feasts in the Gospels.
So much that he gets called fat
a glutton.
Like
yeah.
A glutton. Yeah. And a
consolation to all of us. yeah. So and his vision for what the consummation of this all is at the end is a grand banquet. So there is abundance, and there is goodness, and there is nourishment available. And the reason why there is hunger and deprivation on this planet is not because there's not enough food to go around. It's because the wealth is hoarded by the few. So to the extent that the church replicates that hierarchy, I feel like we are failing our neighbor, but we are also depriving ourselves of the joy that would come from recognizing in a new way that all the things God says about the world are true. It is good news that he has looked on this world and said it is good, and he's looked on us and said they are very good. His judgment is correct, and we have been duped into an inferior story that says that a big flat screen TV and 2 cars in the driveway is part of the recipe for a good life, when in fact this quarantine shows us that what we need is rich relationships and meaningful work and interests that are able to sustain us and sleep and very prosaic and non-costly pleasures. So I think that the church, I saw that your church's vision statement or slogan is about solidarity, abundance, and liberation. I think that that's an amazing summation of what we're called to. If we are wealthy, then we are called to stand with those who are less wealthy, and that means more than just, kind words and offers of prayer. It means that we give them what we have in surplus. Abundance is at the heart of it, and the goal of that is that we will be liberated. And I think that the gospel, the world would say that progress will be achieved when poor people are raised up to a level where their material needs are met, and that's our vision of liberation. That's Bono's vision for liberation. But I think that the gospel is telling us that liberation will take the form of people who are at the top, the Bonos and the Kevins of the world, recognizing that they are weighed down by their abundance, that the surplus of goods and surplus of wealth that I carry is slowing me down on my way to the end of my pilgrimage. And I would be liberated if I let go of it and let go of all of the hopes and dreams that neoliberalism has told me I need to sustain and to work for. So I don't know if that makes sense, but I think dig into solidarity, abundance, and liberation, and you'll end up in a very interesting place.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, that ultimately the shallowness of some of the things that we, I think you're right that this moment in the pandemic, it's like, oh, we need these like elaborate spaces in our house just for entertaining ourselves, and sometimes we want to like gender them heavily, like man caves.
Yeah.
And now it's like everybody just wants to get out of their man cave and go interact with people and be outside in the sunshine. And I think that, to me, I think that that's kind of the perplexing thing about church. And I think that when we talk generationally too, like, how are we going to proclaim the good news to a younger generation that's massively indebted, who's like now experiencing its second economic crisis? And it's to act, not, I mean, have you ever heard of a guy named Dave Ramsey?
I have a friend in America, Daniel Mayfield, who's waging a low-scale war against him. He's this guy who trains people in how to get rich. Is that it?
No, how to be debt free.
Okay,
and I'm gonna have to look up Daniel Mayfield because I'm interested in joining his low-scale war. Because
it's Danielle Mayfield, and she's just published a book called it's about the myth of America. So she's a Christian out in Portland who's doing very good work in this.
Okay, yeah, I'll have to look her up. But so Dave Ramsey is either at one point from Knoxville or like lives here, or I think maybe he has a house in Nashville. Anyway, but I just read this article recently that he's really popular with millennials, even millennials who aren't Christian, because he prescribes this program to help them get out of all this student debt that they have. And it's like insanely draconian. Basically, you build up $1,000 reserve fund, and then you use every penny you have over a number of years outside of that to pay off debt at the expense of basically everything else. And then you can proclaim yourself debt free, but the logic that underpins all of that is this notion that no one is poor in the United States because of economic injustice, because God has chosen this country, because we're the most biblical country in the world, and we live out its principles. So if you're poor, it's your fault. and you need to punish yourself until you cannot be poor anymore. And this story is extremely popular with young people right now because there's no one else telling them a different one. And I think that it's really depressing, first off, to think about it, but secondly, it's a massive opportunity for the gospel to speak and say, actually, no, we're not called to this life of deep austerity and continued just life under this like constant sword of Damocles and things like that. And the gospel calls us to this abundance and to this extravagance because that's the way that God has concerned himself with us. And so I think that you're right that there's a lot of room for creative thinking. And when we enter into the discussion, we find in Jesus a much better storyteller than Dave Ramsey, even though he certainly has used Jesus as a tool to enrich himself quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about austerity, I can't help but think of Saint Lawrence, who was the treasurer in the city of Rome. Are you familiar with this story?
No.
So apparently, the city of Rome had a liquidity crisis, and they, rumors had spread that the church has a lot of money. So the procurator or the emperor, whoever it is, calls for the treasurer of the church, summons him, and it's Lawrence who gets called before the court, and the word comes from the city, liquidate your assets and donate them to the city, otherwise we're going to cut your head off, basically. Taxation and theft, the full deal. And Lawrence skips merrily out of the court, and his friends can't understand why he's so calm about things, but he says, don't worry, I've got it all in hand. The next day, the hour comes, the appointed hour arrives, and Lawrence shows up, and he says to the emperor, behold, the treasures of the church, and behind him are all the beggars of the city of Rome. It strikes me that, austerity as a policy is one thing. That's how we privatize the risk that in capitalism, profit-making entities ought to bear for themselves. But austerity on a personal level, like what Ramsey is articulating, is something that we almost approve of. We would like austerity for the rich in the church. The rich in the church should settle with the boat that they have, and with the cars that they have, and with the widescreen TVs that they have. Hold it there. With the excess that you were planning to spend on the apartment down by the beach, give that to the poor. We want austerity for the rich in the church. Why? Because we fundamentally believe that if we want to find where Jesus is, he's told us in the Gospels he will be amongst the poor. The poor are treasures because Jesus is our King. So Lawrence seems to me to be our patron saint in this, and we need to be able to preach articulately from the pulpit about why the message of liberation that David Ramsey is proposing is actually bondage to those who are unable to fulfill his program, and it's also bondage for those who are able to fulfill his program. Because all it's saying is that if you get more and more and more, you're going to be secure. And it's not fundamentally true. It's storing up treasure here on earth, and the moth will take it. It's a poor investment. So Lawrence, as the story goes, was put to death. And he was put to death over flames. And as the story goes, halfway through, he said, I'm done on this side, lads, turn me over. So he's not just patron saint of treasurers, he's also apparently patron saint of stand-up comedians. But he's a story worth returning to because that fundamental identification with those who are in the margins is not just a kind of progressive cause or a social justice cause, it's a Christological claim. And the path that Dave Ramsey or Joel Osteen or any of the other successful versions of Christianity promise is a path away from Jesus.
Yeah, and I think that's a powerful place to kind of put a pin in this conversation. But obviously, there's so much more to be discussed and thought about when it comes to this topic of wealth. And it makes me think. One last thing is a very funny thing that Amy Laurel Hall used to say to us is that she's like, there are people in your church that during Lent should not be asked to give up chocolate.
Yeah.
And then there are others who absolutely should. And, I've started to think about this in like terms of like, if you just had like a Christmas vacation to the Bahamas, you need to give up something for Lent. But if you're struggling to pay your bills, you need to eat chocolate during Lent.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And, I think the early church and John Wesley, who, if he was around today, I would love to see the problems that he caused, because all of his sermons about wealth, he always starts off with these big disclaimers about rich people. I don't hate you. It's just, I'm trying to help you.
Yeah.
But the early church theologians really had this notion, and I think that this is what you're inviting us into, of our possessions as really God's possessions, that when we enter the kingdom of God, that we give those things over. And so you see people like John Chrysostom saying that if you have more than one coat and you don't wear the others, that you're stealing those coats from the poor. That because what God is asking you to do is to treat them like God's possessions, and what God wants done with them is for them to be distributed to people who don't have them. And let's get back to Matthew 25 here. I was naked and you clothed me, or I was hungry and you fed me, or just on a very basic level. I think it's interesting. It would be interesting to look at socioeconomic realities in the church, is that the poor don't really worship here in this country, because they're just not welcome. And how can you be the Church of Jesus Christ and not be in the body with the poor, the people that Jesus is closest to? I mean, a poor person couldn't become a pastor in the United Methodist Church. They just wouldn't have the means to do it. You have to have, a bachelor's degree and a master's degree. And so I think that at the very basic level is the question that maybe our considerations about wealth should be asking us is, who's missing from the conversation? And the answer is people who don't have enough money to feel like they can walk in the door, which is another argument, I think, in favor of Hauerwas's proposal that people share that information of, what's your salary? And so that, because I think that ultimately what people would find is that I think sometimes people don't want to share that information because they're worried that they don't make enough.
Well, and that's why I've described that as an experiment. I don't think I'd necessarily implement it because of that. Because in this culture, it will be humiliating.
Right.
And also, I suppose it would also be an opportunity for a certain kind of person to ostentatiously declare their success again. But I think that you're correct. Asking who isn't here is always a good idea. I have friends, American friends, who have been very concerned with the racial gaps in the church and the kind of monoculture and silification of worship on a Sunday morning in America. It would seem to me that class is an even more intractable problem because it's that much less visible. Now, look, I'm definitely not the person to advise the American church because I know nothing about it. But I think that a really good proposal for churches in affluent places is to think about what would it take for us to be a community where in 5 years' time the poorest people in our town would be eager to join us here. And what do I know, except I suspect that the Pentecostal churches would be the place you go to for advice there, and that certain kinds of Catholic parishes will be able to tell you what's required. But the Presbyterian and the Methodist churches might need to be remedial students.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah.
Well, Kevin, thank you for joining me. Hope everybody has been edified by this. And I look forward to posting another conversation in the coming weeks.